here when I was 22. I was worn down in a way that went beyond being tired. Work had drained me, and my head was in a bad place. It felt like I was moving through my days on autopilot, like my life belonged to someone else, and I was only watching it happen from a distance. I won't go into all of it, but I will say this. There were parts of my past I had been trying hard to leave behind. More than anything, I wanted to get away for a few days and be somewhere quiet enough that nobody would think to look for me. I must have been saying some of this out loud at work because one day a coworker started telling me about a small island off the coast of Maine. The way he described it made it sound almost painfully uneventful. There was no nightlife. Hardly anyone stayed late, and most visitors came over during the day and left before dark. He said that if you stayed overnight, it felt like the whole island emptied out and became yours. At the time, that sounded perfect. I looked into it that same day and found a vacation rental for a little cottage right near the shoreline. It was detached from everything else, cheap enough to make me pause for half a second, and available on short notice. That probably should have bothered me more than it did, but I wasn't in the frame of mind to question good luck. I booked it almost immediately. The cottage was even smaller than I expected. It was basically one room with a bed, a tiny kitchenette that looked like nobody had used it in months, and a bathroom so cramped it barely felt separate from the rest of the place. Thick brush surrounded three sides of it, pressing close enough to the walls that the whole building felt tucked away or hidden. The front of the cottage faced the water. There was one window there, covered by a thin curtain that didn't really block anything. During the day, you could see out through it. And at night, I got the feeling someone could probably see in just as easily. The walls were thin too. Lying in bed, I could hear the wind pushing through the brush with this dry, whispering sound that seemed way too close, like it was right outside my head instead of outside the building. The front door had both a deadbolt and a chain lock, and both of them looked newer than the rest of the place. I remember noticing that and thinking it was a little strange for a cottage on a quiet island, but I didn't stay on that thought for long. I took a late afternoon ferry over and spent the first few hours just walking around. The place had a weird calm to it. As evening came on, I watched the island slowly empty. Groups of people drifted back toward the ferry landing. Conversations got quieter, shops closed. By the time the sun was down, there was barely anyone left. No traffic, no distant music, no streetlights, just darkness, ocean air, and the sound of the water. It actually felt good at first. I got dinner at a small pub near where the ferry came in. Nothing special, just somewhere to sit for a while before heading back. The bartender was nice enough, but when I mentioned where I was staying, her expression changed for a second. It wasn't dramatic, just a look. A pause that lasted maybe a little too long before she said anything back. I noticed it, but I didn't ask about it. On my walk back to the cottage, I passed a small dock tucked near a cave maybe 100 yards away. There was one boat tied there, a blue motorboat. It stood out because most of the boats I'd seen earlier were larger working boats, lobster boats mostly. This one was smaller and looked more like something a single person would use to come and go without drawing much attention. I clocked it, then kept walking. I got back to the cottage around 10:30 that night. I locked the deadbolt, slid the chain into place, and got ready to sleep. Up to that point, the trip had been exactly what I wanted. Quiet, empty, forgettable. Then I realized my phone wasn't charging. I tried the charger first, then a different outlet, then every outlet in the cottage. Nothing worked. Either the charger was dead or the wiring in that place was a mess, but the end result was the same. My phone battery was already low, and I knew it wasn't going to last much longer. I had a physical ferry ticket, so I didn't technically need my phone the next morning, but still, nobody likes being stuck somewhere unfamiliar with a dead phone. I messed with it longer than I should have, got nowhere, and finally gave up. I was exhausted anyway. I turned in and fell asleep almost right away. I think the lack of sleep from the previous few nights caught up to me the second my head hit the pillow. I don't know what woke me up. It was deep night, completely dark except for the faint gray light bleeding through the front curtain. At first, I just lay there, half awake, trying to figure out what had pulled me out of sleep. Then I heard it. Footsteps on the gravel outside. Not far away, not down the path. Right outside the cottage. Whoever it was wasn't moving normally either. The steps were slow, spaced out, almost deliberate. One step, then a pause. Another step, then another pause. It didn't sound like an animal rustling around. It sounded like a person taking their time. I shifted in bed a little without thinking, and the footsteps stopped instantly. That silence after they stopped was somehow worse than the sound itself. It sat there and stretched out, heavy and unnatural, like whoever was outside had frozen in place and was listening back. I stayed perfectly still, staring upward, trying to convince myself I had imagined it, or that it was some harmless thing moving around in the dark, but I didn't believe that for long. A few minutes later, the footsteps started again. This time, there was no mistaking what I was hearing. They were coming closer, not passing by, not wandering, approaching. I listened as they came right up to the front of the cottage and stopped directly outside the door. My heart started slamming so hard it felt embarrassing, like the sound of it had to be carrying through the room. I remember actually thinking that whoever was out there might be able to hear it. I didn't know what to do except stay silent. Then a flashlight clicked on. The beam hit the front of the cottage and pushed through the thin curtain and the cracks around the door. I could see the light moving, probing, trying to get a look inside. I stayed in bed, barely breathing, every muscle locked up. A second later, the flashlight went off, and then I heard the door handle move. They were trying it. I shut my eyes for a second and just waited for the sound of the lock giving out, but it held. There was a short pause. Then the handle got tried again, harder this time, with more force behind it. Right after that came the banging. Loud, hard hits against the door, one after another. In a cottage that small, each impact sounded enormous. The walls seemed to throw the noise back into the room. I flinched every single time. But weirdly, that was also the moment the shock burned off enough for my brain to start working again. This was real. Whoever was outside wanted in, and staying frozen in bed wasn't going to help me. So I got up. I moved without really thinking, slipped out of bed while the pounding was still happening, and crouched down behind it, low to the floor. I don't know what my plan was. Maybe none. I just knew I didn't want to be lying there in full view if the door came open. Then everything stopped. No more banging, no rattling handle, nothing. I stayed crouched there for a few seconds, trying not to breathe too loud, listening so hard my ears hurt. And then the man outside spoke. "I know you're in there, Leo." The shock of hearing my own name almost made me answer without meaning to. I felt it rise in my throat. Somehow I caught myself before I made a sound. It was a man's voice, low and calm. I had never heard it before in my life, at least not that I recognized, but he knew my name. He knew I was there. A second later, I heard his footsteps move away from the door and continue along the side of the cottage. I tracked the sound as it passed the wall near the bathroom and kept going around the outside. That was the point where whatever little confidence I had left disappeared completely. It wasn't just some drunk person trying the wrong rental. It wasn't random. Hearing my name in that voice, out there in the dark, made my stomach drop so hard I thought I might throw up. It was the most afraid I've ever been. For a long stretch after that, I stayed where I was, crouched and listening. I couldn't tell how much time had passed. It might have been 20 minutes. It might have been an hour. Time was useless at that point. All I knew was that the man kept circling the cottage. I would hear the gravel under his boots, then lose him, then hear him again from another side. Every pass made the place feel smaller. I had no idea what he was doing. Part of me kept bracing for the door to finally splinter inward. Another part of me almost wanted it to happen just so the waiting would be over. Eventually, the footsteps moved farther away. Then I heard an engine start from the direction of the dock. It was unmistakable, that sharp sound of a small outboard motor turning over in the dark. I stayed still and listened as it pulled away from shore and grew fainter over the water until there was nothing left but the ocean again. I didn't sleep after that. Not even for a second. I stayed awake the whole rest of the night, watching the window slowly change from black to gray. The moment there was enough daylight to actually see outside, I unlocked the door and stepped out. The gravel around the cottage told me I hadn't imagined any of it. There were heavy boot prints all around the place, more than one set of passes, circling the cottage over and over. You could follow them clearly. They came from the direction of the dock, looped around the building multiple times, and then led back the same way toward the water. They ended right at the shoreline. The next day is blurry in my memory. I remember returning the key to the property owner. I remember getting on the ferry. I remember sitting there on the ride back and feeling like I was still trapped in that cottage, still listening for those footsteps. By the time I got home, I was in pretty bad shape mentally. What still bothers me most is this. Whoever came to that cottage didn't happen to be nearby. He didn't wander over from somewhere else on the island. He came by boat directly to that dock on that exact night. He knew my name, and he knew exactly where I was staying. A few days later, I confronted the coworker who had told me about the island in the first place. I asked him if he had mentioned my trip to anybody. He swore he hadn't. I believed him too. He looked genuinely rattled after I told him what happened. I said before that I had a past. I'm still not going into details, but I'll put it this way. The idea that somebody out there might want to find me is not the part I struggle to believe. The part I can't make sense of is how they found me there, how they knew which rental I booked, how they knew the exact night I would be alone in it, and worst of all, how long they might have been keeping track of me before I ever stepped onto that ferry. I still don't have an answer to any of that. I still work the same job. I still live in the same place. On paper, nothing has changed since that night. But I've never had a real reason to believe it's over. This happened a long time ago, but I still think about it more often than I'd like. At the time, I was a structural engineer finishing my graduate thesis on concrete degradation in marine environments. It was the kind of subject that puts most people to sleep, but it ended up being the reason I was invited to Japan. That part matters. I was in Nagasaki for an academic conference, and before the trip, I had been corresponding with a professor named Dr. Yamamoto. He had done a lot of work related to post-industrial decay, and through him, I was given access to something I never expected I'd get anywhere near, a research permit for Hashima Island. If you don't recognize the name, you've probably still seen photos of it. It's that small island off the coast of Nagasaki that looks like a gray warship made entirely of collapsing apartment blocks. It used to be a coal mining site and, at one point, one of the most densely populated places in the world. When the coal ran out in the 1970s, it was abandoned. Since then, the place has just been sitting there, decaying. It's now a UNESCO World Heritage Site. Tourists are allowed to visit, but only as part of guided groups that stay on a narrow path along the seawall. The interiors of the buildings are off limits because they're unsafe. Because of the permit, I was allowed access beyond the normal route, which was both exciting and a little unnerving. Before the trip, I had to sign an absurd amount of paperwork, most of it basically stating that if I got hurt in one of those buildings, it was my own problem. The morning of the visit, I took an early ferry from Nagasaki. It wasn't one of the larger tourist boats. It was a smaller vessel arranged through the research office. The only people on board were me and my escort, a man named Tishi. He barely spoke during the ride. I didn't mind. I was too excited to care. Hashima does something strange when you first see it from the water. At a distance, it looks smaller than you expect, almost unimpressive. Then the boat gets closer and the scale starts to register. The seawall wrapping the island, the ruined apartment blocks stacked across it, the dense concrete mass of the place. I'd seen plenty of photographs beforehand, but none of them really prepared me for what it felt like to see it in person. It was honestly incredible. When we got off at the dock, Tishi gave me a briefing. I was allowed into certain buildings outside the regular tour area, and he actually had a list of them. But the permission came with rules. Stay on approved routes. Do not go into anything marked with red tape. Do not remove anything. Do not touch anything unnecessarily. And most importantly, stay within his sight at all times. He repeated that last part. I also had to wear a hard hat, steel-toed boots, and heavy reinforced work pants that made walking more awkward than I expected. Even with all that gear on, the first couple of hours were great. I was taking notes, photographing damage patterns, and looking at the kind of deterioration I'd spent months writing about. I was fully in my element. Tishi mostly stayed a little behind me and kept checking his watch like he had somewhere else he wanted to be. Around midday, we entered one of the bigger residential buildings. The staircase was still standing, but not by much. On some of the landings, you could actually see daylight through cracks and gaps in the concrete. Tishi stayed on the ground floor while I went up, which struck me as odd considering how serious he had sounded about keeping me within view. Still, I wasn't going to complain. Up until then, having him shadow me had been more annoying than reassuring. I was on the 4th floor looking at a section of wall where the concrete had broken away from the exposed rebar when something started to bother me. The dust didn't look right. There was dust everywhere, of course. That whole island was layered in decades of it. But across the floor, I noticed a disturbed path cutting through it. Not fresh, exactly. but clear enough that it looked like something had moved through there more than once. It wasn't random. It followed a route down the corridor and led to a room at the far end. I should have gone back downstairs and told Tishi. That would have been the sensible thing to do. But I was curious, and I had a strong feeling that if I told him first, he would just end the visit to that building and steer me somewhere else. So I followed the path. When I pushed the door open, two things hit me right away, and both of them were wrong in a way that made my skin crawl. The first was the smell. I still don't know how to describe it properly. It didn't smell natural, but it didn't smell like anything familiar either. Not rot, not chemicals, not body odor, not an animal nest. It was just this strange scent that seemed out of place in a sealed-up room on an abandoned island. I know that's vague, but even now I can't compare it to anything else. The second thing was even harder to make sense of. The wall I touched felt warm, not hot enough to burn me, but noticeably warmer than every other surface I had touched that day. I stood there for maybe half a minute, just trying to reason it out. My first thought was sunlight. Maybe the wall had taken in heat somehow. That would have been the logical explanation, except there were no openings above it where sunlight should have been reaching. I tried to tell myself the smell might have come from animals, although I hadn't seen any sign that animals were living on the island at all. I went back downstairs and told Tishi what I had found. His reaction was immediate. And, honestly, it bothered me more than it should have. He didn't ask any follow-up questions. He didn't ask what room it was. He didn't ask me to show him. He just said what I described was impossible, and that there were no people or animals living on the island. That was it. When I pressed him and asked him to come upstairs with me so he could smell it himself, he refused outright. That was the point where the whole trip started to feel wrong. We kept going, but after that, I started paying much closer attention whenever we entered another building. And once I started looking, I kept noticing things. Nothing obvious enough to settle what I was seeing. No clothing, no food wrappers, nothing like that. But there were little signs that something had been there. Disturbed areas, marks in grime. Subtle indications of activity that didn't fit a place abandoned for decades. I say something because I genuinely couldn't tell whether I was seeing evidence of a person or some kind of animal. That uncertainty made it worse. At one point, I mentioned a few more of these things to Tishi. This time, he didn't even bother replying. He just pulled out a radio and started speaking rapidly in Japanese. It was the first time I had seen him use it all day. I asked him who he was talking to and what he said. He told me he was checking the schedule. I didn't believe that for a second, but there wasn't much I could do. I wasn't going to wrestle a radio out of his hand. So I let it go. But from then on, I felt much less safe around him. It started to seem like he knew something and had already decided he wasn't going to tell me. Later, we reached a taller residential block closer to the center of the island. When we got to the entrance, Tishi hesitated. He actually stopped for a few seconds before going in. I remember noticing that because it was such a change from how detached and impatient he had acted all morning. Suddenly he seemed alert. I went inside anyway. The stairwell was narrow, dim, and full of stale air, but it still felt solid enough. We climbed maybe 5 floors. This time, Tishi stayed right behind me the whole way, which only added to the feeling that something had changed. Then I entered one of the corner rooms and saw something that confirmed my suspicions immediately. Against one wall was a pile of blankets. Next to it were a few empty water bottles. There was no explaining that away. This wasn't dust or marks or a strange smell. It was clear evidence that somebody had been staying there. Once I got over the first jolt of seeing it, I turned to call Tishi in so he could stop acting like I was imagining things. But when I stepped back into the hallway, he was gone. That was when the fear really hit me. Seeing those blankets hadn't fully landed at first because I was still focused on proving I was right. But the second I realized I was alone up there, my whole body reacted. It was like my brain suddenly caught up to the situation all at once. Someone else was on that island, or maybe more than one person. I had no idea where Tishi had gone, and all at once I felt exposed. I remember getting this awful crawling sensation under my skin. My arms and neck started itching, and I had this irrational urge to rip off the safety gear and scratch at myself. I panicked. I ran back toward the stairwell we had used, thinking I'd get downstairs as fast as possible and end the visit right there. But when I turned the corner, the stairs were blocked. A pile of rubble had been spilled across the landing, enough to stop me from getting through. I didn't stand there long enough to decide whether it had collapsed naturally or whether someone had dragged it there on purpose. I just turned and ran. I went back past the room and kept moving down the corridor, hoping there was another stairwell nearby. At that point, I no longer cared about the condition of the building, the rules, or the research. I only cared about getting out. Then I heard movement behind me. It sounded like footsteps entering the hallway. I didn't look back. There was no way I was going to turn around and see who or what was behind me. I just kept running. The problem was that the building's layout felt like a maze once panic set in. Corridors bent in directions I wasn't expecting. Doorways opened into more dead ends. I was too scared to think clearly, and it genuinely felt like I was looping back on myself. All the while, I could hear footsteps behind me. At first, I thought it might be Tishi, but after a few seconds, I realized there was more than one set. That was the moment I understood I was being followed by multiple people. I eventually found another stairwell and nearly threw myself down it. My memory after that gets patchy. I remember sunlight. I remember running out into the open. I remember the dock. And I remember Tishi standing there next to the boat like nothing had happened. The sight of him looking that calm pushed me past fear and straight into anger. I started yelling at him. I told him about the blankets, the bottles, the footsteps, the blocked stairwell, the fact that he had disappeared and left me alone in that building. I even accused him of piling the rubble there himself to trap me. He barely reacted. He didn't really answer. He didn't look shocked. He didn't argue. It was like he was waiting for me to tire myself out. That made me even angrier, but there wasn't much I could do. He was my ride off the island. He had control over the situation, and I didn't. At one point, I remember almost hoping that whoever had been following me would suddenly appear in the open, so he'd be forced to stop pretending nothing had happened. Eventually, once I had calmed down enough to stop shouting, Tishi just said we were leaving. That was it. No explanation, no acknowledgement, nothing. I was still badly shaken, but at that point, another thought had started to settle in, and it was almost worse than what happened in the building. I had begun to suspect that Tishi knew exactly what was going on. Maybe he hadn't caused it, but he knew. And if he had caused it, or helped set it up somehow, then I was trapped on a boat with him for the ride back to the mainland. That ferry ride was miserable. I was genuinely concerned for my safety the whole way back, but we made it to shore without anything else happening. As soon as I was somewhere safe, the first thing I wanted to do was report what I had seen. If there were people living on Hashima Island, that was a serious problem. The first person I tried to contact was the only one I could think of who connected me to that visit in the first place, Dr. Yamamoto. I couldn't reach him. 2 weeks later, I was back in the United States, and I still couldn't reach him. It was as if he had vanished. I did try to report what I saw to the appropriate authorities, or at least the people I believed might be able to do something with the information. As far as I can tell, nothing ever came of it. I don't think anyone really believed me. It's been many years since all of this happened, and I still tell the story whenever the subject comes up. But the strangest part, at least for me, isn't even what happened on the island itself. It's what happened afterward. Dr. Yamamoto went out of his way to arrange that visit, pulled strings to get me access I should never have had. And then after everything that happened, I couldn't get hold of him at all. That's the part that stays with me. The thing I regret most is not doing more to find out what was really going on there. If I had spoken Japanese, or if I hadn't had to leave for the US so soon, maybe I could have pushed harder. Maybe I could have found someone willing to listen. Instead, I was left with questions, and I've had to live with them ever since. It's one of those things I already know I'll be thinking about for the rest of my life. This happened more than 10 years ago, back when I was in my final semester of college. I was a history major buried in my senior thesis, and the whole thing was centered on abandoned institutional sites, old hospitals, former asylums, rehab facilities, places like that, especially the ones that still existed in or near major cities. One of the locations I was writing about was North Brother Island. If you've never heard of it, it's this overgrown island in the East River. Technically, it's part of New York City, but it had already been abandoned for decades by the time I was researching it. As far as I know, it's probably still sitting there in the same condition now, but I haven't been in New York in years, so I couldn't really say for sure. The short version of its history is that it once held a quarantine hospital. then later a rehab center, and at some point it became completely off limits to the public. Unless things have changed, you needed a permit just to set foot there. And if anything, I'd assume security around a place like that is even tighter now. That background is really all you need here, though if anyone is into that kind of history, there's plenty more to dig up. You might even find my thesis if you look hard enough. I never had any real intention of going there myself. That would have been illegal. But one night, while I was out drinking with two friends of mine, Jansen and Jesse, I mentioned the island in passing. I was probably complaining about how long my thesis was taking, or how behind I felt. Back then, I was lazy, distracted, and not exactly disciplined. To my surprise, both of them thought the topic sounded interesting, even though neither of them studied history. So I started telling them about some of the places I'd been researching, little facts here and there, and the second they realized one of them was literally sitting out there in the same city we were in, they got fixated on it. The three of us were really into that whole urban exploration mindset back then. At the time, it felt edgy and exciting in the way a lot of dumb things do when you're young. They started talking about North Brother Island like it was the perfect target for a night trip, and honestly, after spending so much time reading about it, I was curious too. Not in a ghost hunting way, more in the sense that if I was going to write about the place in detail, part of me wanted to see it in person. A few weeks later, that's how the three of us ended up moving through Berto Point Park in the Bronx at 2 in the morning, dragging 3 individual kayaks with us. It was one of the few places along that part of the shoreline where we figured we could launch without drawing too much attention, and from there, it was only about half a mile to the island. We had brought a bunch of supplies, honestly more than we probably needed, but we told ourselves we were being smart. The plan was simple. Push off around 2:30, spend a few hours on the island while it was still dark, then get back before sunrise. At the time, it felt reckless in the most exciting way possible. Getting the kayaks into the water turned out to be easier than I expected. The park was completely deserted at that hour, and for a few minutes, it almost felt too easy. But once we actually started paddling toward the island, the reality of what we were doing started to settle in. There was no real backing out anymore. Nothing stood between us and that island except the water, and with every stroke, the excitement started mixing with nerves. Still, we made it. Getting ashore was harder than we expected because of all the growth along the edge. We had to force our way through reeds and thick weeds just to find a patch of ground firm enough to drag the kayaks onto. Once we were standing there on land, the three of us kind of paused without saying much. It was dark, obviously, but we had flashlights, and the moon was bright enough to outline the larger shapes around us. The first thing that hit me was how quiet it was. I know that sounds like a cliche, but it really stood out. We were still in New York City. The Bronx was right there, not far at all, and yet it felt like we had slipped somewhere far outside the city, somewhere cut off from it. No traffic sounds, no voices, just this stillness that didn't seem right. We started moving inland. It didn't take long for Jansen and Jesse to realize how large the island actually was. I had told them before that it wasn't just some little patch of land. I'm pretty sure I had even shown them a map at one point, but they clearly hadn't pictured it properly. The deeper we went, the more buildings we passed. Some were partially collapsed. Others were so swallowed by vegetation that you could barely tell they had ever been buildings at all. At one point, Jesse stopped in front of a structure with a tree growing straight through the middle of it, splitting it apart. He said it looked like something from one of those post-apocalyptic video games where you're wandering through the ruins of civilization. He was right. That was exactly the feeling. Nature had taken over everything in a way that didn't feel normal. It was like the island was in the process of erasing all proof that people had ever lived there. If I hadn't known the history already, I would have guessed the place had been deserted for far longer than a few decades. We checked out a few of the buildings that still looked stable enough to enter, sweeping our flashlights through rooms that probably hadn't seen visitors in years. Most of them were empty. Then, in one of the larger buildings, Jansen found a half-used can of spray paint near a doorway. The second he picked it up, he wanted to use it. Jesse agreed immediately. I told him not to. I said it felt disrespectful, not just to the buildings themselves, but to the history tied to the place. People had lived there. People had died there. But they pointed out that the walls were already covered in graffiti in some areas, some of it pretty elaborate, and they argued that adding a little more wasn't going to change anything. I didn't feel like having a long argument over it, so I told them I wasn't going to physically stop them, but I also wasn't going to stand there and watch. Looking back, splitting off from them was probably the worst decision I made that night. I moved through a few more rooms on my own, trying to take in details I could use later for my thesis. But the farther I got from Jansen and Jesse, the more uneasy I became. It's hard to explain unless you've been somewhere like that. When you're with other people, even in a place that feels wrong, there's a kind of built-in buffer. You tell yourself nothing too bad can happen when you're not alone. But the second that buffer is gone, everything changes. I was walking down a long hallway in one of the bigger buildings, which I think may have been part of the old hospital complex, when I heard Jesse call my name. The voice came from somewhere ahead of me, from one of the rooms farther down the hall. Even though I knew it sounded like Jesse, the sound still made me jump. I remember stopping for a second, then starting forward, but almost right away, something about it started to bother me. For Jesse to be in front of me like that, he would have had to take a completely different route through the building. That wasn't impossible. There were other hallways and stairwells, but it would have meant he had split from Jansen almost as soon as I walked off, then moved fast enough to get ahead of me for no clear reason. It didn't make much sense. There were too many side rooms branching off the corridor for me to tell where the voice had come from exactly, so I called out and asked where he was. I got an answer right away. This time, the voice came from a room a few doors down on my left, and it was definitely Jansen's voice now. All he said was, "In here." So I walked toward it. The doorway looked darker than the rest of the hall, and the hall was already dark enough. I couldn't make out anything beyond the frame. My first thought was that they were messing with me. That was exactly the kind of thing Jansen would have found funny, especially if he thought I was getting too serious. So I stepped into the room and swept my flashlight across it. The beam landed on someone standing in the far corner, facing the wall. For a fraction of a second, my brain tried to force it into something familiar. One of my friends. A prank. Some dumb explanation that would let me calm down. But it wasn't either of them. Whoever it was, they were way too tall. At least 6.5 feet. Maybe taller. Jansen and Jesse weren't anywhere near that height. I can still remember the exact kind of fear that hit me in that moment. It wasn't gradual. It was immediate and total. I screamed without even meaning to. Then I turned and ran. I didn't care about being quiet anymore. I was yelling for Jansen and Jesse as loud as I could, telling them to run. I was more scared than I had ever been in my life. It felt like if I slowed down for even a second, whatever had been standing in that room was going to come after me, or something else was going to step out from one of the black doorways I was passing. I found my friends near the place where we had separated earlier. The second they saw me sprinting toward them, they took off running too. None of us stopped until we got back to the kayaks. Once we could breathe again, I told them what I had seen. At first, they didn't believe me, which I honestly understood. If Jansen had told me the same story, I probably would have assumed he was screwing with me. But I kept insisting I wasn't making it up. I told them I knew what I saw. After a minute or so, they started looking just as rattled as I was. We agreed to leave. Whatever curiosity had gotten us onto the island was gone by then. Nothing we had come for was worth staying any longer. But right when we started dragging the kayaks back toward the water, all three of us heard something. It came from somewhere behind us in the dark. It was faint, but clear enough that none of us could mistake it. It sounded like a woman moaning, an older woman maybe, not screaming, not calling out loudly, just this low sound like someone crying softly or reacting to pain. It wasn't close, but it was close enough that once we locked onto it, we could hear it clearly. None of us said anything at first. I could see Jansen and Jesse starting to panic, and I know I was doing the same. My hands were shaking so badly it made it harder to get the kayak into the water. We finally got off the island and started paddling back, and that trip felt much longer than the one out there. But we made it. On the drive back, the three of us went over everything again and again, trying to make sense of it. We kept searching for some explanation that sounded normal enough to believe, but the part I couldn't get past was the voice. I know Jesse's voice. I knew it as well as I knew my own. What I heard in that hallway was Jesse's voice. I'm sure of that. And yet, Jesse had not been in that part of the building. He had been with Jansen the entire time. I've thought about going back over the years, but I never have. For one thing, I'm pretty sure getting onto that island now is nearly impossible. From what I've read, they've cracked down hard on unauthorized access. I doubt I could get anywhere close to it today without being stopped. I've never really believed in the paranormal. I still don't. At least not in the way some people do. But I've never found a good explanation for what happened on that island that night. Someone was there with us. Someone knew my name. And somehow, whoever it was called to me using Jesse's exact voice. I don't think I'm ever going to know what really happened out there.